Hello and welcome to the Grim Tutors, your one-stop shop for all things Magic the Gathering. I'm Colton, also known as Pez.
And I'm Oblivion. So, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about the stack and the layers.
Ooh, like pancakes?
Like an onion.
Ooh, crepes.
I love a good crepe.
What about priority? Are we gonna talk about priority?
Yeah.
Huh. Well, that sounds like fun. You do realize that's like the thing I'm the worst at, right?
Yes.
How are we gonna make that work?
I mean, I guess we could have a video of me just talking for an hour, but I don't think that makes very good content.
Can I phone a friend?
Yeah.
See, I told you phone a friend worked.
Hello, phone a friend.
Hello.
Hello. Would you like to introduce yourself to the fine people at home? I'm a bad Vanna White.
Sure. I'm Tyler from Play to Win, and I play a lot of CDH and reasonably rules lawyery, which I feel like that's going to come up.
Yeah, it probably will, because I don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, I don't either, but the internet does, and the comprehensive rules are a really heavy read, but they're there, and all 287 pages of them, they're available at any time.
Let's just start with why it's important. Why are we talking about this? Why does this matter?
Ooh, priority really matters, especially the more competitive you get, and particularly in competitive settings. I would say priority is something that players who are playing casually are, and especially ones that know each other, are usually able to negotiate just very intuitively without it being a problem. But the order in which people are able to do something on the stack, meaning in response to someone else's spell or action or whatever, and before it resolves, is really important, because maybe one player wants to do something like counter a spell, and another player also wants to counter it. Who does that first, and who gets to still have a counter spell in their hand at the end of that, is going to be a matter of priority, basically.
So it's like Magic's way of taking turns on the playground, basically.
Yeah, it's turns about turns. So, you know, there's the normal turn order where you're taking your actual turns with the main phase and stuff. But then there's a little tiny round of everyone gets a turn every time any action happens. Pretty much any action.
So that's pretty much like what priority is then, is just when there's an action, everyone
else gets to respond to said action.
That's almost like a little too Barney for my taste. Like, why does everybody get an action?
They might want to respond to it.
I don't want you to respond to my things.
It's a group game. Well, yeah. So then you have to play stuff like Dosun and just say no one can play spells on my turn. They still get priority, but they probably can't do anything unless they have channel cards.
Priority being kind of like, you know, playground, taking turns. How does it work? Like, how do you decide whose turn it is on the slide?
Like whose turn it is to have priority? Yeah, that's a great question. When any player takes an action, the player who just took that action is the one that has priority. However, if they don't say I'm holding priority, meaning I'm going to do this action, but then I'm immediately going to do something else after it in response to it, then they're assumed to be taking that action and then passing priority. And priority goes to the player after them in turn order. So that's true even if they're not the player whose actual turn it is. So for example, if player A casts a lightning bolt, player A, passes priority on the lightning bolt because they don't say they're holding priority. Player B says, all right, I'm going to cast a counter spell now that I have priority, targeting that lightning bolt. Immediately after that, the person who has priority is not player A, even though it's player A's turn. It's player B because they just took that action. And now the priority on the counter spell goes player B, which we assume they'll pass it unless they say holding priority, and then player C, and then player D, and then player A. And once player A passes, then the counterspell would resolve.
An action occurs, and the player who is taking that action, or whose turn it is, depending on the situation, can either hold priority to take another action, or it will go through turn order. And if something else happens, like a spell is countered or a fetch land is cracked or something like that, it restarts from that person and around.
Who took that action? Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so when you hold priority, it's because you are going to
You're responding to your own action.
You're saying before anyone else gets priority on my action, I'm going to take another action.
I mean, holding priority is like mostly for people who are casting like Fastest Oracle and Demonic Consultation, right?
Yeah, that's when it comes up all the time. It does come up in Kinnan too, technically, with the Mirage Mirror line. Not everyone knows how to articulate, but Mirage Mirror, the way that you win in Kinnan using Mirage Mirror to turn infinite colorless into infinite colored mana is by activating the 2 mana ability to turn it into something else a bunch of times, and you hold priority each time so that you can just fill the stack completely with Mirage Mirror activations before anyone else can do anything. They can still interact with it later. There are ways to mess with it, but that's the only other, I think, one that commonly comes up in competitive EDH. And I think holding priority comes up almost never in casual, like pretty darn close to never.
Right.
Is it something that really would come up in like any 2-player formats? Or not really, because it's you and the other guy?
Oblivion. What the hell is a 2-player format?
I heard that they exist, and I have to be honest and open about the fact that I heard from a bird that they exist. I don't know
I've
about
played
it.
Modern here and there once in a while, many years ago. I do like it. I actually play Standard Brawl once in a blue moon too, but I can't think of situations in which you hold priority in 2-player formats, but that is something that people who play 2-player formats are certainly going to tell me I'm wrong about. And I imagine the more complex and the larger the card pool, so I'm specifically thinking of Vintage and Legacy, there are probably instances where it does come up. I just don't know them.
That's fair.
I would agree with you, but I also do not know them, as I am not a savvy Vintage or Legacy player.
Neither am I.
So if you are a savage Vintage or Legacy player, get in the comments and make us look like idiots.
So we kind of mentioned it. When does priority trigger? When does it happen? Is it just anytime an action's taken? Do I have to physically do something?
Mostly it's anytime an action's taken. It's also the last thing that happens in each phase, not just steps. So there, there's a main phase, but combat has many phases to the combat step. In each phase, you don't move from one phase to another in a turn until every player has passed priority on an empty stack. That is like officially what signals that you're moving to the next phase of a turn. Like we've said, this usually is something you can feel out intuitively. People will kind of go like, if they are trying to do something. But there are times when, especially when people are holding a lot of interaction and a lot of instant speed things to do, that they will, ask that, hey, I just need us to like pass through priority and be pretty strict about turn order, phase movements, that sort of thing.
Or people will say, like, I have actions on your upkeep or something.
Yeah, they'll alert you like, hey, I know you would normally kind of fast forward through this phase, but I'm just letting you know I need you to stop there.
Could it be safe to say that there are more opportunities for like priority and responses than people are even aware of, but because people often just play so casually, we don't know?
Absolutely.
Or we don't pay attention?
Yeah, I think the more you play and the more complicated and competitive games you play and the more rules sticklers you play with, the more you will find that, there are all these hidden moments that are happening, and kind of part of the social contract is you try and, figure out where people are and not overcomplicate it, because it's going to make the game take forever if you insist that everyone passes priority explicitly every single time they would receive priority. So the happy balance is somewhere in there. And that's hard. It's challenging, especially at high rules enforcement levels. For judges to kind of figure out what is, acceptable shortcutting and someone indicating non-verbally that they're passing priority and what isn't when the player tries to contest it later. There are instances where you do not have to go out of your way to point out to your opponent that, something like protection from everything is the case. This can be the same thing with things that are buffing creatures that weren't triggers that could be missed. If you are under no obligation to point out to your opponent that something they missed, that it's just a thing that was introduced into the game is impacting combat.
This is something that I know is particularly appealing to you. Maybe it's a soft spot, maybe it's a sore spot, I don't know. When kids don't get along in the playground and they want to be bullies and bully people with their priority.
Of all the actions that people can take, even ones that don't use the stack, like mana abilities do still reset around a priority. And so what this means is that sometimes players will use that knowledge to pass on something that they could interact with. Like maybe, let's say it's a game-winning thing, like Demonic Consultation has resolved and the Thassa's Oracle trigger is on the stack, and they have a Stifle, mysteriously, even though no one plays Stifle. If they have that, and the whole table knows they have that, the table is saying, look, you have to cast this, otherwise we just lose the game immediately on the spot. What players can do, I take issue with it. I don't really like that this is how the rules cause this to work out, but they can pass anyway. If a player down the line has mana abilities they can activate, and then force those players to tap down mana sources to keep resetting the cycle of priority, so that they can force a later opponent to tap all the way down before they will use that spell. This can also be a way that they're like bluffing and saying, well, I don't have anything, even though they really do, and hoping that an opponent is going to spend a counter spell on it instead. That's a kind of a risky gambit, because your opponents can also just say, I am not playing this priority bullying game. I'm not going to reset priority by activating a mana ability, so we will just lose. And when I'm in this situation, that if I feel like this is about to come up, I will always say that I'm not playing the priority bullying game. I will not tap down mana just to reset priority. We will lose if you pass on this.
Right.
I feel it's important to politic that out early. But yeah, I think it's an unfortunate quirk of the rules that I think feels bad to a lot of people.
I think this kind of has to do with priority. I'm honestly not sure, and I've seen the acronym around everywhere. I know what it stands for, but I don't know what it means. I think it's AppNap, or active player, non-active player. Does that have to do with priority, or what does that even mean?
Sort of. It behaves similarly. This is something that I kind of find confusing as well. So this is something I have to double check. But active player is basically just the player whose turn it is, short of what we talked about, where someone takes an action on the stack and they are the first one that has priority on their own action. The rest of the time, kind of the default way that priority will move is from active player, the one who has the turn, who is also the first one to get priority in each of the phases of their turn, to each non-active player. So each other opponent, other player, in clockwise order.
I'm looking at Tyler's board, and Tyler has pesky Birds of Paradise in play, and I don't like that bird.
My boy!
I'm gonna tap my red source and bolt the bird.
My boy.
I have now put Lightning Bolt onto the stack. Priority will now get passed to Tyler.
You have cast it, you're not holding priority. So now Tyler's next. What does Tyler do?
So there are two things that I would most likely do. If I had a counter spell, there's a reasonable chance I would counter a bolt on the birds. Depends on how important it was in that moment. And that would be me getting priority after you have cast the lightning bolt and inherently pass priority, because you didn't say I'm holding priority, and then saying, all right, I'm going to cast this swan song targeting this lightning bolt. But another thing that people will commonly do is just if a birds is being bolted or a mana source is getting destroyed, they'll just say, in response, I'm going to tap this down. So they're activating the mana ability of that mana source before they lose the ability to do so when that spell resolves. And that's another thing that you don't precisely have to have priority to activate a mana ability, but because it doesn't use the stack, but that it commonly comes up in that instance. And as we discussed earlier, activating a mana ability does reset around a priority.
So if you chose to cast a counter spell, then the priority would move to the next person. And if you chose to activate the mana ability, it would also move to the next person.
You're right. Activating a mana ability returns priority to the player that is activating it, because essentially they activate it and resolve the mana ability at the same time. But then they are the one with priority, so that it'll pass from them in a clockwise direction.
If the only thing that you could do was get some juice out of the boy, and the next player passes and I pass on it, then the bolt would resolve and the bird would die and go see Bird Jesus.
Well, it resets the priority to the player activating. So technically the bolt player would need to pass on the bolt again. And then it's Bird Jesus time. Yeah. This is one of those things that almost always happens wordlessly. You can assume 99% of the time that me tapping the bird in response to, much more than 99% of the time, that me tapping the birds in response to the bolt is not going to change desire for the bolt to resolve or do anything else about it.
Now that I think I understand priority a little bit better, I feel like we can safely move to the stack. I'm just gonna be real with you guys. The stack is hard. The stack is really hard.
It is hard. And trying to do both of these things at the exact same time trying to remember both things at the exact same time is what is real difficult, but also really fun about Magic.
Right.
Agree. I think priority gets to kind of just happen relatively smoothly and not really get noticed by beginner players most of the time. Unfortunately, the stack is a moment that you have to have, because it is the mechanism by which things kind of end up working out in unexpected and counterintuitive ways. And so I personally, having taught a reasonable amount of people how to play Magic, I really dread the moment where we have to be like, okay, well, this doesn't happen the way you think it does. I know you giant growthed your creature, but because I'm lightning bolting it in response, even though it gets bigger enough to survive it, it's still going to die before that would happen. And then that fizzles. This moment is probably the moment that turns a lot of new players off to Magic, where they're like, well, this sounds like bullshit, and it sounds like you're making up rules, right?
Yeah, like, why does your thing still get to work and my thing not? It's hard, and trying to find resources to help you is also hard. When I was learning how to play Magic and I was trying to understand these things that these dudes at my LGS were saying, and they're like, it goes on the stack, but this goes on the stack first, but it's AppNap. And I'm like, okay, well, what if I try to Google it? Like, I can totally understand it if I Google it, right? Incorrect. Not in this sense, because anything that you look up to try and figure out, like, what the fuck is going on in this pancake situation, get it? That's a stack joke.
Another thing with stacks, layers.
Yeah, layers. Yes.
Each one of the pancakes have a different sauce and stuff on it too. There's so many things.
In trying to learn about the stack, everything that you look for, and in trying to get more information, assumes that you understand how the stack works in the first place. So it's like, here's a detailed layered walkthrough of 5 different things that hit the stack really crazy. That's great. I still don't know what the fuck the stack is, so that's zero help to me.
I think one big mistake that people make when they're playing with newer players and trying to work out the stack is just relying on verbalizing it instead of physically building the stack of cards in the middle of the table, because it's still hard to understand what's going on. But when you physically see things go on top, get resolved if everyone passes on them, then possibly trigger other things that still go on top of everything else that was already there, like, you kind of get the sense of, okay, this can keep getting built on, and we're only resolving as fast as everyone is passing priority if they're not doing stuff. The concept of first in, last out, which is what the stack is like also kind of a mathematical concept, but also really familiar to anyone who's ever loaded a truck. Like, I mean, if you know, the first pallets that you put onto a truck are going to be the last ones that come out, because they go all the way in the back of the truck, right? And it's kind of the same idea. So it you know, it's really helpful for most people, I think, to do this visually. And the fact that the stack always just gets handled verbally is like really thwarts new players, especially, you know, from consuming content that is for only marginally enfranchised players. But like, the stack is the first big, like, oh, I turned the corner and I get Magic now.
I'd like to think I've turned the corner. I might still be on the corner. I could be approaching the corner, but like at a stop sign, peering
around the corner.
Yeah, just like kind of startled, a little frightened behind the wall kind of thing. Because it is a lot. And I think something that is helpful too, especially when it comes to the stack, is kind of the life cycle of a spell, because there's more to just casting a spell.
Let's talk about zones for a second, because I think it's really helpful in understanding, you know, where all these triggers can fall and interact, and why a cast trigger and an enters the battlefield trigger are actually a lot more similar than we think of them as. You know, we just spent all this time talking about the stack without kind of acknowledging that the stack does behave like a zone. So when we're talking about zones, we're talking about the battlefield, the library, the graveyard, the hand, the command zone, the companion zone, and sometimes and exile. Like, these are the main zones. You know, something is always in one of those places. But as we'll touch on in a second when we really get into how to cast a spell, the very first thing you do when you're casting a spell is you move it to the stack. And even though no one will get priority before that spell would go back to your hand, if you, like, for whatever reason fail to cast it or can't cast it, without people getting priority, there is a moment in time that the spell goes to the stack and isn't in your hand. Like, that is the first thing that happens when you're starting to cast a spell. Once you have successfully cast a spell, you're essentially saying, okay, this is locked in on the stack. And that is when a cast trigger happens, is when a spell that has been moved to the stack, you know, all the payments happen, all the stuff gets confirmed, and you say, we're golden. And now the action of moving from your hand to the stack is saying, okay, we have done everything we needed to do to confirm this is staying on the stack. Now we are taking this zone movement and saying this triggers anything that says when you cast the spell, or anything that the spell does on cast. The same way that once a creature is confirmed and everything's resolved, and we say, okay, this is resolving from the stack and moving to the battlefield, that is when we get the enters the battlefield trigger, like, okay, I'm on the battlefield now. Anything that cares about me entering the battlefield my own trigger or other triggers or other players' triggers, those are all going to go on the stack now. A great number of the triggers are based on zone movement like that, and thinking of the stack as a zone is really helpful, I think, in understanding that. I think usually resolve gets used to refer to just the whole sequence of executing all of the text on a card after everyone has passed priority on it and said, okay, we're going to do this action. I say text on a card, but if it's an ability, then the text of the ability, whatever the text is that is being executed. Anything that happens or triggers as a result gets put on the stack during resolution, but no one gets priority during resolution of a spell. And then the last step before someone does go ahead and get priority again is that spell moves from the stack to presumably the graveyard, unless there's something telling it to go to a different zone, which sometimes there is. But mostly it's the spell then goes to the graveyard, and okay, then we're done. The spell has resolved.
Or it's a permanent and it's moved to the battlefield.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. We just said resolve. I'm thinking only non-creatures and not permanents, but yeah,
some
permanents will move to the battlefield, not the graveyard.
That, want stuff and not just telling people.
All formats want stuff. I was just being a goofball. Yeah, anything that's a permanent will move to the battlefield.
What goes on the pancakes? Does everything go on the pancakes? Is there anything that doesn't go on the pancakes? The pancakes are on the stack. Yeah, because I'm clever and
I like the pancakes.
I'm good with words.
So what do you mean? What doesn't go on the pancakes? Like any actions or anything like that?
Yeah, what goes on the stack, and is there anything that doesn't go on the stack?
Yeah, I mean, just about everything goes on the stack, minus mana abilities. We talked about those.
Right.
Things that happen as part of mana abilities also don't precisely go on the stack. So an example that my judge friend told me was Chromatic Sphere is a good example, because that's an ability that, unlike Chromatic Star, draws a card as part of its mana ability. So when you activate that mana ability, which doesn't use the stack, you draw that card just right then and there, without it doing anything on the stack.
Okay.
So mana abilities, Morph, I think, is also a special action that does not use the stack. Yes. I believe that applies to both Morph and Manifest. Megamorph is just another Morph, yeah. Okay. Manifest tokens, you can flip them over, and it says you can flip them over at any time for this creature's mana cost, which is why it's like a special action.
Playing a land, does that use the stack?
Oh,
because it's not a
example.
Spell.
Great example. No. Playing a land does not use the stack. It doesn't go on the stack, just goes directly into play.
So playing a land and activating a mana ability, and anything that may come from activating said mana ability. If there's a specific thing, that's it.
I think so. I'm sure someone in the YouTube comments will have something obscure, but yeah, these are the only ones that I can think of.
But there are some instances where you can stack things. Like, let's say you have an ability where you do something and you can scry, and then you have another ability where you draw a card. You can choose to scry first and then draw a card, or draw a card and then scry.
Here's an example I'll use where you get to choose the order and a couple things are going to happen all at the same time. Let's say that I have a Soul of the Harvest, which is a 6-mana creature that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and I cast an Eternal Witness. Eternal Witness also cares about enters the battlefield. It has its own enters the battlefield effect that says when Eternal Witness enters the battlefield, return target card from your graveyard to your hand. If I don't really care about what card I'm drawing, I don't really care necessarily about what order these are resolving. But let's say that I have a Noxious Revival in my graveyard, and I want to specifically put something on the top that I want to draw with my Eternal Witness. Maybe I haven't drawn a card for turn and I want to put a miracle card on top, or some kind of weird scenario where I just don't want to get that card back directly with Eternal Witness. I can choose to stack these and say, all right, I'm going to first put the Soul of the Harvest trigger on the stack that says I draw a card, and then on top of it, second pancake, short stack. We're going to put the ability from Eternal Witness that says, all right, I'm going to return this Noxious Revival from my graveyard to my hand. And then I will resolve the one that Eternal Witness says, and return that Noxious Revival to my hand. And then the Soul of the Harvest trigger is still in the stack. So if I want to use Noxious Revival to draw something other than what I was going to draw off the top of my deck, I can do that.
That's
right? I can continue to respond to this. But if you wanted to stack them in the other order, I want to draw this card first and then return the thing to my graveyard. You can do that too. There are times that this matters more than that example. This one, usually you would just be able to return whatever you wanted with Eternal Witness. So short of miracle, like I said, I think that wouldn't really come up. But there are definitely times that ordering your triggers and how they're resolving matters. And a lot of times it does have to do with whether you're drawing cards before you're shuffling your library. I feel like that comes up pretty often. I feel like another one that comes up a lot now that I think about it is in the case of like do you want to scry or surveil in this case before you draw the card? If you have Dragon's Rage Channeler and say like Whirlwind of Thought or something like that. Whirlwind of Thought is an enchantment that says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, draw a card. Dragon's Rage Channeler says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, surveil 1. You're almost always going to want to do the surveil 1 before you draw the card. So they're triggering at the same time. So you choose the order, same as the other one. So you'll say, I'll put surveil on the stack second so that I surveil first, give myself a better chance of drawing a card I want, and then draw the card. Same kind of deal.
The player choosing the order, I think if I remember correctly, if they are your triggers, you choose what order they go in. So like
exactly
like in the Dragon's Rage Channeler example, if you have a draw trigger and a surveil trigger, they are yours, so you choose what's happening first.
You choose which pancake goes where.
Right. Or even like an upkeep trigger, like let's say you have a Pact of Negation that it would like tap you out completely, but you're also at 3 life and you have your mana crypt. Be smart to choose to flip for your crypt and see if you die before paying all of your mana into trying not to die when you could just die anyways.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Same deal there. And as we were talking about AppNap before, that's where it comes in, where if they're not your triggers, then they're always going to go on the stack after yours. So any opponent's triggers that happen as part of the same event. So maybe, we're talking about Ristic Studies. If you have something that says, like Dragon's Rage Channeler, whenever you cast a spell, surveil 1, your surveil goes on the stack. If you're an active player and you say cast the Soul Ring, but your opponent's Ristic Study trigger goes on the stack after that. So their Ristic Study, you'll have to choose whether you're going to pay 1 before you get to surveil with Dragon's Rage Channeler. Always.
Gotcha. You can choose the order that your stuff goes in, but non-active players always goes after your stuff, right? That's what you just
exactly
said, right? Okay.
Yeah, and if your opponent had a Mystic Remora and a Ristic Study, they would technically choose the order that those go in, because they have 2 of the same event, even though it's your turn.
Right.
So it's always about the player who controls the effects. They get to choose what order they're going on the stack if they trigger as a part of the same event.
Because even if you don't have the mana to pay for fish, they still have to like announce that they cannot pay for the fish.
Yeah, the ability that goes on the stack with both fish and Ristic, it's not that it goes on the stack, if they do have the mana to pay for it or something weird like that. The ability just reads in full, like, okay, they may pay for it. If they don't, you may draw a card, right? So that all resolves at once. It's not like 2 separate pieces. They pay for, you get to find out whether they pay for before you resolve it or something.
Okay, yeah. It goes on the stack. It goes on the stack, period. But when it comes like its turn in line, and that's the thing that's going to work on being resolved, that is when you can determine, are you paying for this, yes or no? Yeah. And then the fish stick player can say, I am going to draw a card, because it's a may.
Yeah.
It's a lot more important now in a world of Orcish Bowmasters.
I was going to bring up Orcish Bowmasters.
We'll bring it up, baby.
The fish stick, the Ristic Study player stacked their fish and then Ristic Study.
Yeah.
So then their fish goes, but then Ristic Study is still here, and the Orcish Bowmasters would now fall on top of the Ristic Study pancake.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. This matters a lot. Let's say there's 2 Orcish Bowmasters. This matters a lot because it will potentially allow one of the Bowmasters to kill the other off of that draw. The other may also point that damage at the opposing Orcish Bowmasters too. Point being, like, you can get rid of them before that other Ristic Study draw is even going to happen.
It's something that came up in my modern tournament that I played in last week, where my opponent played their Bowmaster first, and then I got to kill their Bowmaster with my Bowmaster because I was second Bowmaster player.
How would it be determined if there was a fish stick situation, right? Okay.
Let's talk it out all the way. So let's say player B has so player A has cast something and has their Dragon's Rage Channeler trigger on the stack. Yeah. Player B has a Ristic Study trigger and a Mystic Remora trigger, and players C and D both have an Orcish Bowmasters on the field. So if the player does not choose to pay for the Mystic Remora trigger and that player chooses to draw, both of the Orcish Bowmasters are going to trigger, and they're going to trigger in AppNap order. So whoever active player is, the player whose turn it is, which is player A who has the Dragon's Rage Channeler, not player B, who has the Mystic Remora effect. Player C is the next in turn order from that player. They will get their Orcish Bowmaster's trigger to go on the stack first, meaning it will resolve second. Player D will put their trigger on the stack second, meaning it will resolve first. But to put the trigger on the stack, they have to announce targets, right? So if the Bowmasters are going to kill each other, player C is the one who's going to announce what the target of theirs is first. Then player D is going to announce. So if player C points it at that Bowmasters, and then player D says, well, fine, screw you, I'll point it at your Bowmasters, then those are going to end up killing each other. If player C wants to take the opportunity to politic and say, I can point it somewhere else if you agree to point it somewhere else, then they might both point him somewhere else, right?
Say the Dragon's Rage channeler doesn't have Delirium, the Delirium plus ones yet, so
yeah,
you politic to kill the Dragon's Rage channelers with each other's Bowmasters.
Gotcha. So even though it doesn't matter who cast and had their Bowmasters enter the battlefield first, it's about who would be next in priority from the active player.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Because you, in those instances, if someone were to draw a card, you would direct a point of damage somewhere. Because player C's Orcish Bowmaster trigger goes on the stack first, they have to determine where theirs is going before player D's Bowmaster trigger can go on the stack, because that is part of it entering the pancake zone. Is that they have drawn a card, so your next thing is I will amass one and direct a point of damage somewhere.
Yeah, there's basically two times that the legality of a triggered ability, like a Bowmaster's ability, gets checked. To put it onto the pancake zone, like, okay, do you have a legal target? Like, do you have a valid target? And then when it's trying to resolve, it also gets checked for legality again. Is your target still legal?
This is also kind of stack related, but when can responses be made? When can I choose what and when to respond to?
Yeah, you can respond to anything anytime you get priority. This is just the priority discussion all over again.
Right.
I mean, I guess technically there are the special actions we were talking about that don't use the stack, but that doesn't really mean you can precisely just do them at any time and kind of interrupt people to do them. So for example, like mana sources and stuff, the only time you can activate those is when you have priority for any reason or when you're paying for something. So like if something asks you to pay a cost, miscast is the 3 mana. Counter it unless you pay 3. Those are a time that you wouldn't, during the resolution of that spell, you don't have priority because you're in the middle of the resolution of a spell, but it's asking you, will you pay 3? And you can activate mana sources to pay for that 3. So that's like an action that you're taking without having priority. Okay. But short of those things, you're more or less only responding to something or taking an action if you have priority.
This comes up so often in Kinnan, right? If I'm trying to blow up your Basalt Monolith or something like that.
Don't do that. It's against God.
So in the times where, you've got Kinnan and you've got Basalt Monolith, right? And you can just if I try to blow it up, you can still do all of that in response to me trying to blow it up kind of thing.
I actually think this is a good example worth talking about for sure.
Yeah.
Because it comes up. So if I have a Basalt Monolith and I have a Kinnan says when you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with Basalt Monolith,
right?
Yeah. With Basalt Monolith, which normally taps for 3 and has an ability that says pay 3 generic to untap it, so it's like kind of net neutral. It can just bounce back and forth. And instead taps for 4, and then you can say I'm gonna use 3 of that 4 to untap it. So when a Kinnan deck is trying to win by generating infinite colorless mana and then somehow converting that to colored mana or whatever, the time to interact with them is when they say, okay, now I'm going to pay 3 to untap it. At this moment, I have 1 mana floating left from that Basalt Monolith. It's not infinite yet. You can point an Abrade or, whatever you want, something that destroys a permanent, a Chain of Vapor, something like that, at this Basalt Monolith and say, okay, I'm going to bounce it before that untap ability resolves so that you're not able to start, tapping it again and just keep going.
Got
it. If that Kinnan player has 4 mana from other sources still available, they can just say, 3 mana from other sources still available, including that 1 floating. All they need is 2 more to say, all right, I have this untap ability on the stack, which hasn't resolved yet. You're blowing it up in response to that untap ability. I will respond to your blowing it up by putting an untap ability on the stack. So they'll try and go over top of you if they have enough mana to do it again, and just say, I'm going to untap it before you get to blow it up. And then blowing it up and the old untap one are still way down here on the stack, but they're just going to try and generate infinite mana before any of that happens.
Above it.
Right.
Okay.
And then once they have infinite mana, say, Okay, you blew it up. Too late.
It's like that right in that spot. You have to untap it, but the untap can't resolve yet.
Yeah,
kind
exactly.
of deal. Another one that I was thinking of was Flusterstorm, right? Flusterstorm makes a copy of Flusterstorm based on the storm count, which is the number of spells that were cast during this turn.
Yeah, Storm is a pain in the butt because it's a trigger that happens when you cast a spell. The same way like that big Eldrazi have triggers that happen just when you cast the spell.
So it doesn't matter what's resolved during that turn or not. It matters what was cast. Whether it resolved or not doesn't apply to storm count.
It just cares about how many spells were cast. Yeah.
Okay.
And notably, it doesn't care about how many spells were copied. So if something else with Storm got cast, it only counts that as one, even if that Storm created 5 copies of its own.
Let's say the Storm count is 5, and there's all this interaction happening. Because usually people try to use Flusterstorm as like the last stack interaction, because that's what makes it better, right? So when you cast it, it's making those copies 5 in this example. And that's when you're choosing where to point them, right? Is like when there's, so like each copy could go a different place, right?
Yes.
If you wanted it to, because you can choose new targets.
Yep. The storm trigger happens and then puts all these copies on the stack, right? So as long as people can respond to the storm trigger saying, I'm going to make all these copies of Flusterstorm, but they usually don't. When all these copies go on the stack, each of them needs to have a target in order to go on the stack. So once the storm trigger resolves, you take those 5, did we say was the storm count? We take those 5 copies and say, all right, I get to choose the target individually for each of these 5. And then the original is still in the stack and also has a separate target.
I'm trying to win. You're trying to force me out of it. So I'm flustering it at your force of will, we'll say. And I point all the copies at your force of will. Doesn't that mean that in order for your spell to resolve, you would have to find a way to counter all 5 copies?
Or if you had the mana to pay for them. Because each copy of Flusterstorm just says counter that spell unless its controller pays 1 generic. There's worlds in which like maybe I can pay for 4 and then have a free counter spell to counter the other 2. Like that, this can happen. It's unusual. Usually the best answer to a Flusterstorm is another Flusterstorm. Because it just creates 1 more copy and you can counter each of the copies individually. The other great answer to a Flusterstorm is a Mindbreak Trap. Because it, yeah, look at you go.
Well, I couldn't remember if Mindbreak Trap was 3 or any number, because I think it's as long as 3 spells have been cast, you may exile any number of spells from the stack or something.
Damn close. As long as an opponent has cast 3 spells. It can't be you that's cast 3. But yes, as long as an opponent has.
And then, so with Flusterstorm, the storm count makes that many copies and there's still the original. So if the storm count was 5, there would actually be 6, right?
Right. 6 total Flusterstorms. Yep. It might be worth saying that you can start to cast a spell even if something says you can't. So some restrictions don't get checked until you already started casting the spell. And the reason this matters is that then when you back that up, like that is knowledge that your opponents have. And it's not like, oh, well, you have to pretend you didn't know I had this or something. No. You can announce a spell and choose the kicker and the modes and the alternative costs and all that stuff, the mana values, the targets and all of that stuff. And then after you've locked all that in, realize, oh hell, there's a freaking void winner. I cannot do this. So not all of them are like this. Like rule of law effects apply before you can even announce the spell. Some things care, like void winner cares about odd or even. Things can change the spell's cost, especially if you have like X spells or something like that. There's a check that happens later in that step. So it's worth knowing that some restrictions prevent you from even trying to put something on the stack, and some restrictions will let you start to cast a spell and put it on the stack, but then say, oh, no, you can't do it. You got to back it up and pull it off the stack.
So there's replacement effects and there's triggered effects. And sometimes the replacement can't replace the trigger. It's all very confusing. You ever been yelled at on Twitter because you got a rule wrong?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Maybe on YouTube, not on Twitter. Comments on stuff like that have Storm, if you haven't noticed. So trigger effects and replacement effects, 2 different categories. Triggered effects are telling you about something that happens when something else happens. Ristic Study is a great example that a lot of people know. When a player casts a spell, this ability goes on the stack that says you draw a card unless they pay 1 mana, right? Or you may draw a card unless they pay 1 mana. Replacement effects are saying when something would happen something else happens instead. So the original thing doesn't happen and this other thing happens. The other really big difference here is that replacement effects do not use the stack because they're just saying this is an instead thing, whereas triggered things do use the stack. They go on the stack and say, all right, people can respond to this. They can, determine how this is going to go. Rest in Peace just says
exile all graveyards and then there aren't graveyards anymore, right?
Yeah. Okay. And the way it does there aren't graveyards anymore after it enters the battlefield and exiles all graveyards is it says if a card would go to the graveyard, instead remove it from the game. It says it in different words, I think. Exile it instead, maybe. I'm not sure. What it's getting at is if this would happen, instead you're going to just exile it. It's never going to hit the graveyard to begin with. This is different from something that would say if a card hits the graveyard, then exile it and is a triggered ability. Because that would use the stack. So there would be a moment with that on the stack where it's in the graveyard and hasn't yet been exiled. But then when that triggered ability resolves, it is exiled. Right. Whereas a replacement effect never goes to the graveyard in the first place. It literally replaces the original effect.
A replacement effect replacing basically removes any triggered events from happening because at that point they aren't happening anymore. If you have effects that happen when creatures die and you don't have a graveyard, you do not get those effects because death means that they have left the battlefield and gone to the graveyard, but they don't. They go to exile instead. So it like circumvents all of those things. Yeah. So what happens when there's like more than one?
I think a good example that comes up a lot here is if you have two Notion Thieves. So a replacement effect gets one chance to affect something, right? So it doesn't affect the same event more than once. When the effect is applied, any other effects that need to be applied that are part of the same event get applied in sequence, and then it's done. So if two people have a Notion Thief, one of them kicks in. So the relevant part for if you have two Notion Thieves is 616.1. So this is saying if there are multiple replacement effects attempting to modify an object or player, the affected object's controller or the affected player chooses one to apply. And if more than one player has to make this choice at the same time, the choices are made in active player, non-active player order. Basically, the affected object in this case is like the draw. The draw is what's going on here, the card that is trying to be drawn, the one that's being impacted by two different Notion Thieves. If a player is just trying to draw a single extra card with a Notion Thief, with two Notion Thieves out and nothing weird, as long as both of their opponents are the people who control those Notion Thieves, both of those replacement effects are going to attempt to apply. They are going to choose which one is going to get applied first, and ultimately, therefore, choose which draw is happening. If we call them players A, B, and C, A being the one who's trying to draw, B being the first one with the Notion Thief, C being the second one with the Notion Thief. After the draw is replaced by one of the other players' draws, the other Notion Thief doesn't attempt to apply to that draw again. It already is. It already has done its applying to that one. So whichever one is applied second is the one who will end up getting that draw.
Kind of alluded to like a checks and balances where the game checks itself before it wrecks itself. I think that those kind of fall in line with like state-based actions. What is that?
So state-based actions are basically, as you said, the sort of the checks the games are doing in between actions and in little moments between other things change to kind of make sure that anything that should have changed or move zones or something like that is doing that, whether or not someone's received priority. Generally, state-based actions are checked whenever a player would receive priority. There are some times that they're not checked, and this does come up. I have an example ready for this one that comes up in CEDH and is really confusing. So whenever a player would receive priority, state-based actions are checked, and then any triggers that are waiting to get put onto the stack get checked. So we talked about that when we talked about like going through resolving a spell. You go through the text and like triggers basically like start piling up as you're going through that spell, and then they get put on the stack after the spell is resolved, but before anyone gets priority, because this is when state-based actions are checked, etc., etc. So the example that's really relevant with Tayum is it has a 3 mana ability, 3 generic, but there's also a cost of remove 3 counters from among permanents you control. And there's a 1 green mana creature called Wall of Roots that says once per turn you can put a -0 -1 counter on it. One of the only times you'll hear that, to generate a green mana. As part of paying for the cost of Time's ability, just to get the ability on the stack, you can activate that mana ability, which puts the -0/-1 counter on it, and also remove that counter as part of the remove 3 counters from among permanents you control. So as a result, it can temporarily have 0 toughness, but not die, not go to the graveyard, because you're in the process of activating this ability, and at no point between when you started activating it and Wall of Roots was, I guess, a 0/1. It had 4 -0/-1 counters on it. And when you finished activating it and it had less counters than that, had even greater toughness, at no point in there is the game aware that it actually hit 0 toughness, even though it looks to us like it temporarily did. There's one other good example that I wanted to share that Hot Judge Seth, who I checked with for some of the rules stuff we're covering today.
So he's hot and he's a judge and his name is Seth? Is that?
Oh yeah, it's great. He's delightful. He mentioned Psychosis Crawler, which is a star creature that says, its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in your hand. When you're resolving a Wheel of Fortune, there's a moment from the player's perspective where they have no cards in hand, so you would think it would temporarily be a 0/0, but it just, state-based actions are never checked in between when Wheel of Fortune starts to resolve and when it finishes resolving, at which point you have 7 cards and it's a 7/7.
Only other thing that I have written down is layers.
The things that change anything about cards, mostly effects that modify characteristics of cards, though sometimes also things written on the cards themselves, they get applied in a certain order, and the reason they're called layers is not because they're like the stack necessarily, but because you go from one layer to the next and you never go back. You really want to think of it more like when you're kind of deciding what the whole piece of pie is, you apply each of the layers only once and then you're done. You're never going back to a previous layer, even if something in a later layer changed something that would make something in an earlier layer seem like it's different now. The very first thing that it gets applied is like what's written on a card. These are also referred to as copyable values, because when you like copy something with a phantasmal image, remember you don't get like any of the stuff that's attached to that card or that's impacting it or anything like that. You just get the card as it's written, not any other junk that's happened to it since then. So just the values, the characteristics of the card itself. Then in layer 2, control effects are applied. So this matters for stuff like Gilded Drake. This is where anything that changes the control of a permanent gets checked, is right after the copyable values but before anything else. Control effects are something that is time stamped, so that means whatever the latest one to happen is the one that applies. So if someone casts a control magic and says, I control this permanent now, and then I cast a Gilded Drake and say, aha, no, I control it now, both effects are basically still applying, like they still exist, but mine has the later timestamp. It's the most recent. So in the same way that we talk about like first in, last out, in this case we're talking about whatever is the most recent is the one that takes precedence.
So it's not forgetting that the other person did have it at one point, but the fact that you have it is the thing that matters.
Yeah,
is that
which comes up.
Okay.
Definitely. And this comes up a lot with Gilded Drake, because if a player loses the game and they had a Gilded Drake that was applying a control effect to something, that control effect stops happening when that player loses the game. So then the player who originally controlled it would get it back, unless, like the example we just said, there's another control effect that was applying after that with a later timestamp. Someone has original control of the permanent they cast just by default. Then someone casts control magic. Then I Gilded Drake it. If I get killed and the Gilded Drake effect gets removed, it doesn't go back to the original owner of that permanent. It goes back to the person who has a control magic that says, I control this now. Because that is still applying. It never stopped applying.
There was just something else that applied over it.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Layers.
So I understand magic so much right now.
So after the control changing effects in layer 2, layer 3 is stuff that changes text. So this is like Magical Hack, as an example. Layer 4 is where we do type changing effects. Blood Moon, that turns non-basic lands into mountains, applies here. So does Imprisoned in the Moon. This is something that changes a creature that is enchanting to a land. So that one also sees some play in Commander. After that is when we get color changing effects.
What's things type that changing effects? Colors?
There's cards that will change the color of a spell.
Painter's Servant, somewhat common examples.
I was gonna like pure lace and crimson wisps and
not
like crimson wisps. It makes any spell red.
That sounds made up.
No,
not anymore.
I'm just using. I don't remember. Oh, that's true.
Target creature becomes red and gains haste until end of turn.
It does gain haste.
It does.
I knew it.
So you're both right. Okay, so then.
Well, I was wrong, but kind of right, because it does make something red. But I said it turns any spell.
All right. Well, we were both a little right. How about that?
I don't like your Kinnan, and I'm tired of it, but I can't blow it up because the only thing that I have is a blue elemental blast, but it's blue. So I can't blow it up, but I could if I turned it red, which would be such a silly thing to do.
Why use 2 card when 1 card do trick?
Right, exactly.
After that is where all the ability adding effects and like keyword counters, things that say an object can't have an ability. So this is like the Archons, for example. All of those ability things apply in layer 6. So the first time I found out about layers was when I was playing in Theros block, and there were archetypes of endurance or archetype of imagination, I think was the blue one. Each color had one, and all of them say creatures you control have this keyword ability. It was hexproof for green, it was flying for blue, etc. Creatures your opponents control lose that ability and can't have or gain that ability. So the question was, if 2 different players have that, what the hell happens, right? Because they're all applying in the same layer. And what it boils down to in that particular instance is that can't overrides can, and the timestamps do technically matter because timestamps apply here too for ability granting and removing things. But essentially all the can'ts on the card win. And just nothing has those things if 2 players have them out. Yeah.
Nobody gets.
Yeah, nobody gets shit.
Nobody gets presents.
Nobody gets shit. No Christmas this year, kids. Layer 7 is just power and toughness changing effects. They do apply in a particular order. I don't think that's worth getting into. But this covers everything from your giant growths to your like plain old like +2/+2 from some other source, or like other humans you control get +1/+1. All that stuff is applying here at the end of that stuff that switches power and toughness, which is its own ball of wax.
Those are the counters layers. Include on that? Because there's a difference between something getting like a giant growth temporarily getting +3/+3 or put a +1/+1 counter on something.
Yeah,
because that
this is also where counters apply. Keyword counters apply in layer 6. +1/+1 counters, or -0/-1 counters for that matter, apply in layer 7. The nice thing about layers is it is kind of complicated in that you have to work through that list of 7, but whenever you're figuring out what something has, what state a card is in at the time that another layer gets applied to try and figure out what's taking precedence, you just start with layer 1 and go through each of those. You do them one at a time. You never go backwards and say, okay, now that this has changed, I go backwards. And then when you arrive at the end, you should be in the correct state of what this card actually has going on at the moment.
Do you have any final thoughts, additional musings, anything else that you would like to say that you feel is important or impactful or relevant, or just because you want to say it in regards to priority and the stat?
Not really. Just with all the topics we covered, Magic's hard. It is good to talk it out with your friends. It is good to try and Google things. It is good to read the comprehensive rules, but don't ever just read it as a block. Just Control F that motherfucker. It is way too long. But most of all, if you have access to a judge, ask them. They are super friendly. They really want to help you, and most judges are like delighted to discuss rules, which, I mean, I guess we kind of were for the last couple hours, but I don't know if I have this in me all the time. Holy crap.
Right.
It's a lot. It'd be a lot to remember. Anything else that you would like to say, state, plug, sing, whatever? Any other?
Yeah, I just want to give a call out to Hot Judge Seth, as I mentioned before, who was gracious enough to talk to me to try and get my understanding right of some of these things before I made a fool of myself. I hope I disappointed him terribly. I think I may have in some instances, but I really appreciate that. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you, Hot Judge Seth. I can't wait to see how hot you are.
Bless up.
Bless up.
PlayToWinMTG.com or PlayToWinMTG on YouTube. Go find our stuff. We only talk about CEDH for the most part, but there's a lot of stuff you can learn from CEDH and apply to other formats, so check it out.
And they're also very nice and incredibly handsome.
Ooh, we'll have to agree to disagree. I don't know.
This hair is just protruding out of your glasses. You're welcome.
I'm glad you caught that because I had no idea what was there.
Yeah, it's just like horizontally just sticking out.
Where are my roommates? Someone come over here and groom me. Help that.
Why are you staring at me?
Because you were talking. I was looking
okay. At you. I was like saw it in the preview and I was like,
I'm staring at you too.
Sorry, my bad. Yeah, keep talking.
I love it when I have all these handsome fellows teach me stuff. Nice. I'm gonna be so fucking good at magic, you guys. Because he's next in turn order.
Because he is next in turn order.
we got to hug him once. That was cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
10 out of 10 would do again.
You mentioned a green one. I think Clayton, right? What was it called again?
He's gonna just call you Clayton forever at this point. It's very funny.
Should I be calling you Pez?
No.
It's because his name's Colton and you have always called him Clayton. And it makes me laugh.
Are you
so
fucking
hard.
serious? Oh no! I'm so sorry.
It's totally fine. It's very funny.
No.
This is like the second time we've actually talked to each other, so it's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Why didn't you tell me sooner?